In 1995, a police officer, Deputy Sheriff William Hardy, was shot and killed while off-duty working as a security guard at a hotel in Birmingham, Alabama. Police were determined to crack this case, apparently at any cost. They arrested 5 men in connection to the murder. In 1998, they wound up convicting this man, Toforest Johnson. He was sentenced to death, and he's been on death row for more than 20 years.
Writing about Toforest Johnson's case and became familiar with the outrageous facts of this case. Really, it's just like absurdity after absurdity. It's perfect to tell in the podcast form because there's so many twists and turns. There's so many different steps and missteps that had to happen for Toforest Johnson to end up in prison wrongfully for this murder.
Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how's it going today?
It is going fantastic today, Tim. Thank you so much for asking. I hope everyone who's listening, I hope they're doing as fantastic as I'm doing, because the person who we're speaking with today taught us so much about the legal system, the ins and outs, and really brought a lot of these frustrating details to our attention, but I think that's important because then we need to identify them and see how we can fix them. But Tim, you need to fix me right now by letting me know how you're doing.
I'm doing great. Thanks a lot for asking. Yeah, Beth Shelburne joins us in this conversation. She's a journalist and an investigative reporter, and she's really great and has a new podcast with our friends from Lava for Good. It's called Earwitness, and it's about the murder of Deputy Sheriff William G. Hardy and the man who was convicted for this murder, Toforest Johnson.
And Beth does a really great job working with Toforest's family and showing that aspect of this experience, this unfortunate experience that they're having, while simultaneously uncovering all of these injustices that happened during the trial and prosecution of Toforest.
So you can check out everything that Beth is up to at bethshelburne.com. You can check everything we're up to at Crawlspace Podcast or Crawlspace Pod on social media. And also, if folks want to listen to Crawlspace ad-free and early, you can do so now by subscribing to Crawlspace Premium. It's available on Apple Podcasts, but if you're not an Apple user, you can go to crawlspace.supportingcast.fm and sign up for the same product there. You get those ad-free episodes, early releases, and our weekly bonus show. And this is all bundled with Missing and Dark Valley, 2 other fantastic podcasts from Crawlspace Media.
And Tim, lace them up, because our nonprofit that we are on the board of, Private Investigations for the Missing, they're hosting their first ever 5K run/walk for the missing. This is on Sunday, October 8th at 11 a.m. You can run in person in Reading, Massachusetts by registering at piftm.org/run. All of the proceeds go to that nonprofit, Private Investigations for the Missing. You'll get a t-shirt, you'll get entered into a raffle, but if you're not available to run in person, you can run virtually, and you can try to beat John Lorden's time. Just take a picture of your time after you've completed your 5K and submit it. That'll be sort of the official way to register that. Again, the proceeds from even the virtual registration go to the nonprofit, and you can run that 5K now until October 15th.
We'll see you there. And we're going to break quick for commercial, and we'll be right back with journalist Beth Shelburne. Welcome to the podcast, Beth Shelburne. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
We're doing fantastic. We're very excited to be speaking with you. This interview came pretty quick, so we had to assemble all of our, get the old ducks in a row and make sure that we were prepared for this, because the body of work that you've done with this show, with this case, this story is amazing. And we really wanted to make sure that we caught you before everybody else did.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. I am coming to you now from my hometown of Birmingham, Alabama. I was born and raised here, became a reporter after college, and my plan was to get out, leave Birmingham, go see the world. And I lived in other places working as a TV news anchor and investigative reporter for about 14 years. In my reporting, covering news here in Birmingham, I have always covered a lot of crime, being a general assignment reporter and a journalist that does investigative work. But I began reporting on Alabama's prison system, which you may or may not have heard is in a total crisis, and the federal government is suing the state over it. And that was kind of my entry into doing critical reporting, looking at things like the conditions inside our jails and prisons, the amount of time that we're sentencing people to for crimes, and also wrongful convictions. And that's how I came to know Toforest Johnson's case and started developing this project in 2020. And here we are. It's an 8-episode podcast.
Now, why was podcasting the medium you chose to tell this story?
For the sunglasses and the paparazzi, Tim.
Oh, yeah. All the money and the perks. No, that definitely was not the reason. I have always loved radio and listening to audio stories. And of course, when podcasts kind of exploded in the last decade, I became a big fan and, really sort of shifted the way that I consumed information, from reading newspapers and watching TV shows to listening to podcasts all the time. And I really liked serialized storytelling. I was, particularly drawn to, some of the early blockbuster podcasts like Serial, In the Dark, The Accused, some of those stories that would take one case and really unpack it over hours and hours of time. And so when I started writing about Toforest Johnson's case and became familiar with the outrageous facts of this case, really, it's just like absurdity after absurdity, I thought, now this would make a really good podcast. This story seems like it's perfect to tell in the podcast form. One, because there's so many twists and turns. There's so many different steps and missteps that had to happen for Toforest Johnson to end up in prison wrongfully for this murder. Two, so many of the voices involved in the story, particularly Toforest's family, are just really compelling voices. And I was immediately drawn into their experience and what this has been like for them. And that's not a story that is amplified a lot. And I thought, giving his family and his community a platform to share what they've experienced in this injustice, while also trying to unwind how this happened, how the hell this innocent guy ended up getting put in prison for a murder of a sheriff's deputy that he couldn't have committed because he was somewhere else when it happened. I felt like, a podcast was the perfect place and way to do that. And so with my background in TV news, I kind of understood how to work with audio and how to tell long form stories. So I just went for it. And hopefully it worked. We're really proud of what we put together, and I hope listeners tune in and really like it too.
Yeah, and I think you nailed it when you said that the story is very conducive to the podcast form, that serialized form where they talk about one case and you unpack it. And part of unpacking is you discover the pieces that you didn't think were going to be interesting along the way. And then maybe they become something that was more of a surprise to you and more of a storyline to you. The families are very important in these cases, but more often than not, you don't hear them being mentioned right away. So I think it's cool that his family is very focused on in this story and in your explanation, which is something you can't get from like a 5-minute news clip. And it just, with the podcast, it can exist indefinitely. And even interviews like this, 10 years later, somebody might hear this interview and go, oh, what was that show? And go back. Hopefully, Toforest is out of prison at the time, and they can say, thank God he's out. But can you give us some of the background of the crime and maybe a little bit of his background, his family, how he even got to be in this situation?
Sure. I'll start with the crime. This was in the mid-90s in 1995. So it was pre-cell phones, back when Biggie and Tupac were on the radio. We all were wearing beepers, trying to get a hold of each other. So that's the world that existed then. And that's the world that Toforest Johnson was living in. He was 22 years old, living in Birmingham, Alabama. And he had a rough upbringing. His family had a lot of issues of poverty, substance use. His father was an alcoholic and was abusive, and it was particularly hard on his mother, Donna. She ended up leaving his father and moving in with another man when Toforest was in his teens, and they lived in a public housing project known as the Brickyard in Birmingham, and it was essentially an open air drug market. He, during this time, had 7 friends that were shot and killed. He was actually shot. Toforest was shot in a drive-by shooting. The bullet is actually still lodged in his chest because doctors thought it would be easier to leave in and just heal than to remove it surgically. But he was in the hospital for 3 months, and nobody was ever prosecuted for any of these crimes. But that was the world that he was living in. It was rough. It was volatile. His mom was trying very hard to make ends meet and work multiple jobs, but Toforest had to grow up really early. She leaned on him to help take care of his younger brother. So by the time he was 12 or 13, he was getting his brother up for school and getting him dressed and making sure he had something to eat. So he had a lot going on at a young age. By the time this murder happened, he was 22 and he had already been sent to prison for drug possession. So, that was an initial strike against him, is having a felony on his record and having done prison time. I think there's a presumption of guilt that comes with that when you're a young Black man and you've already got a felony on your record.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor. Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
The night of the murder, Toforest went out to a club with one of his friends, a man named Ardragus Ford, who was actually paralyzed in a wheelchair because he had been shot. So that's one thing that we've learned about and just found appalling, is just the sort of ambient violence that so many communities have to contend with and that is present in so many people's lives, where they have no sense of safety or agency, to avoid it because it's just everywhere, this gun violence. But that night, Toforest Johnson and Ardragus Ford were going out to a nightclub, and across town, the victim in the crime, a veteran sheriff's deputy named William G. Hardy, he went by Bill, so we refer to him as Deputy Bill Hardy in the podcast. He was working a part-time job as a security guard at a hotel, and so he moonlit there overnight to make extra money. And this was a business hotel. It was called the Crown Sterling Suites. It's now an Embassy Suites. So typical sort of mid-range business hotel. It was a good gig for a deputy to work security at a hotel like this that was pretty quiet and mainly, utilized by business people. So around 12:45, 12:50 in the early morning hours of July 19th, Deputy Hardy was working his shift at the hotel. He was sitting in the hotel's atrium, smoking a cigarette and drinking coffee, which he often did during his shift. And for some reason that nobody knows the answer to, he got up and walked down a hallway out these glass double doors on the back of the hotel into the parking lot, where he was shot execution style at very close range twice in the head and died 7 hours later. So the crime was one of those very mysterious whodunits. No one saw the crime happen. Almost everyone in the hotel was asleep. So there was a handful of people that heard gunshots and went to their windows and saw a car leaving the scene, but no one actually saw the crime. There was no known motive, just really almost no evidence to go on, but a veteran law enforcement officer who has been shot and killed under these mysterious circumstances. So you can imagine there was a lot of pressure and emotion on the detectives that worked the case to get some people into custody. They were really scrambling and feeling a lot of heat.
So I'm assuming that right there goes to the hasty arrest of Toforest, that they needed somebody to not pin it on. I don't want to put those words out there, but they needed a responsible party. How did that all come to be?
Yeah, we actually interviewed the lead homicide detective for the podcast. We talked to him for 7 hours on the record. So it's one of the things that makes this series so interesting and I think different is we're not like chasing down the people that participated in this investigation and prosecution. They sat down with us and went on the record, which was pretty astonishing. But he admits that they felt that pressure. And he has some regrets about rushing through these first initial weeks because of those emotions and because of the pressure from his superiors. But they had almost no leads in the first couple of days, but they announced a reward for information in the case. And that reward eventually grew to $20,000, which is a pretty big reward in a criminal case. That's about $40,000 today. And after they announced the reward, the phone started ringing. And one of the calls they got was from a woman named Rosa Hardy. And she said, my 15-year-old daughter has information about the crime. So detectives brought this 15-year-old girl in. Her name was Yolanda Chambers. And from the very first conversation she had with detectives, she continuously changed her story and what she told them. She went from saying, no, it's not true, I don't know anything about it, to being very vague and saying these guys that live in another part of town had something to do with it, to then saying that she heard the people that did it talking about the crime, to then saying, oh, I was actually there and I witnessed it. So her story was constantly evolving and changing, but in the course of multiple interviews with police, she implicated Toforest Johnson and 3 other young Black men. And so about a week after the murder, 4 young people were arrested and charged with capital murder based on the word of this 15-year-old witness.
And the lead homicide detective, he was homicide, right? Is this Tony Richardson?
Tony Richardson, yes, is the detective that led the investigation.
Right. And he's featured in, right now I think you have 2 episodes that you dropped yesterday, so that would be September 13th. So he's featured here, and he gets to, like you said, have the opportunity to sit down and revisit this. What is he feeling as he's hearing these details come out and realizing that they probably screwed up big time here?
Well, I think he's feeling a lot of feels. We talked to him for 7 hours, and there's a lot of ambiguity there with him and with the lead prosecutor that we also interview and who will come in later in the series. Tony Richardson admitted a lot of regrets that he has, but also was defensive of the tactics that he used and the process that they went through. So, he's one of these people that embodies a lot of different things at the same time. And I think that's what makes him a fascinating character. I think a lot of people will listen to him and be outraged. I'm very grateful that he agreed to talk to us, because I think that it lets us in to the mind of a detective and how they think and how these kinds of cases were worked, and then how they view them in hindsight, and how difficult it can be for people to be honest with themselves about mistakes that they've made. I think that there's very little framework in the criminal justice system for system actors to say, I made a mistake. I wish that we wouldn't have done this. After talking to him for over 7 hours, there are different points in the interview where he comes to that place. But to say that we went round and round with him would be an understatement. The first interview I did with him was about 5 hours, and I really felt like I'd been beaten after that interview. It was like, he's an experienced interrogator. And so, he had an answer for everything that I asked him. And it was like one of the more difficult interviews that I've done, because, he's got a lot of rhetorical strategies at the ready as an experienced interrogator. But I think that the interview is very telling. And I think that it really speaks to a lot of the problems that we see in wrongful convictions, like confirmation bias and tunnel vision. What happens when you have a case like this, where there's so much emotion and so much pressure to hold somebody accountable and so little evidence about what actually happened? So I'm really glad that he's part of the series. And even though I think it's going to frustrate a lot of people, I think we gotta listen to what he says and how he remembers this, and listeners can decide whether they believe him or not.
Yeah. Now, what does he say about Toforest's alibi during the time of the murder?
I'm so glad you asked about that, because it's one of my favorite parts of the series. In episode 4, we contend with his alibi and confront Tony Richardson with it. I think that one thing that has surprised me in doing this investigation and studying this case is how much discretion detectives and police have in believing an alibi or not believing an alibi. And really, that's what this case comes down to: who is believed and who is not believed. Toforest Johnson and Ardregas Ford were at a nightclub called T's Place, and we have at least 10 people that remember seeing them there in the time frame that Deputy Hardy was killed. And they have very specific memories about that particular night. All of them have different reasons on why they remember that night. First and foremost, it was a Tuesday night, which was Tasty Tuesdays at T's Place, and women got in free. So we talked to several of the women that would go every Tuesday because they could get in free. And they were there the night of July 18th, 1995 for a particular reason. And they remember seeing Toforest pushing Ardregas in his wheelchair. They remember what they were wearing, what they drank. And they have remembered it over the years because they heard about Toforest and Ardregas being arrested the week after the murder. And when they heard the news, they all thought, well, how could this be? We saw him at T's Place. So some of them spoke to police. Some of them didn't come forward because they were scared to talk to police, with good reason. They thought they would end up in jail. And some of them ultimately testified in front of juries that they saw Toforest, but for whatever reason were not believed by the jury, or were discredited by prosecutors. But Tony Richardson at first told us that no one came forward to corroborate Toforest Johnson's story that he was at T's place. We were able to obtain archival audio of Tony Richardson actually interviewing alibi witnesses. It was in the investigative file who confirmed Toforest's alibi. And so we confront him with that, and listeners can hear his reaction and what he does in response. But I think the takeaway for me was alibis are really difficult if there's no video evidence or something concrete to support the alibi. Oftentimes the word of multiple people, 10 different people that aren't even connected to each other, often that's not enough for a jury or for cops, sadly, and it wasn't enough in Toforest Johnson's case.
Okay, going to Tony Richardson and his reaction to hearing this and realizing that this is probably the case, that Toforest is in prison unjustly, and it's partially or the majority of that is through his doing. Did he ever indicate what the repercussions would be on his end if he owned up to a mistake that was made? Because we hear it a lot, like with these wrongful convictions that, they don't want to admit the mistake. But what is the repercussion? We never hear that end of it. Are they going to get discredited or fired or something?
That's a really good question. Tony Richardson is retired now. So presumably if he admitted to mistakes and that he had doubts about Toforest's guilt, now there really wouldn't be any repercussions because he's no longer working. He's retired, but he's not going that far. He's really straddling a more ambiguous space where he's saying a couple things all at the same time. From the people that I've interviewed for the podcast, there seems to be a unanimous understanding that it's incredibly difficult for people in law enforcement and prosecutors to express doubts about something that they've already presented as fact, to question something they've already entered into the record. And really the status quo is to stick with the story. I've tried to get into the psychology of that and why that is. And I think that the best that I can explain it is it's hard for people to admit they're wrong. And within the culture of law enforcement and prosecutors, it seems to be particularly hard. I don't know if that's because it's majority of men and there's some kind of toxic masculinity thing going on. As far as repercussions, I mean, that's a really important thing to ponder, I think, because one of the things that we conclude at the end of the series is that, this is a story about a wrongful conviction with one person at the center of it who's in prison currently and is at risk of being executed for a crime that he didn't commit. But this story really amplifies a lot of problems in our criminal justice system that thousands of people have to contend with every day that end up getting charged with crimes or swept up into cases. And so it's not just a story about Toforest Johnson. I think it's a story about many systemic problems that we have. And one of them is that it's damn near impossible to overturn a case once a person is convicted. I mean, you literally cannot argue that someone is innocent. It's not a legal argument that you can present post-conviction to overturn a case. They have to attack their case through some procedural error or some other facet that was, a rule that was broken in the process or something like that. You can't just, present a motion saying this person is innocent. And so I think that can be a real problem because unless he can get his case overturned on some procedural grounds, or unless a court will agree that he deserves a new trial based on all these things that have come up about the key witness in the case, he's stuck. And I don't know about you guys, but that's really not good enough for me. I mean, I am not okay with that. I am uncomfortable with the idea of people who are innocent sitting on death row just because there's not a legal avenue for them to overturn their case.
Yeah, I don't understand how is he on death row? How it seems like a very harsh sentence for a pretty flimsy case, obviously.
Yeah, he was charged with capital murder because the victim was a law enforcement officer. And so in Alabama, felony murder can be upgraded to capital murder under a variety of circumstances. And one of them is if the victim is a law enforcement officer. So capital murder, there's only 2 possible sentences in Alabama, and it's life without parole, which basically means you're staying in prison until you die, or you're getting sent to death row. And unfortunately, the jury recommended death in a 10-2 vote in Alabama. The jury recommendation doesn't have to be unanimous in a death penalty case. So it was 10-2, and the judge affirmed that sentence. But you're right. I think there's a myth or a misconception among most Americans about a person who ends up on death row, where they think there must be 100% scientific proof that this person did it. And that's not the case. There are many cases that are tried that are purely circumstantial. And Toforest Johnson's case is one of them. It was predicated on the testimony of a single ear witness. And when I first heard about the evidence against him, I thought for sure that it was an exaggeration. I did not believe it. I thought, okay, well, I'll look at this case, but surely there's got to be more. Because even in 2019, when I had already been doing a lot of reporting on criminal justice issues, I think I still wanted to believe that a case like this was impossible, that you couldn't be sent to death row just because one person claimed that they overheard you talk about the crime. But that's it. That's the whole case against him.
And it doesn't matter that the individual, in this case, Yolanda, that doesn't qualify for a retrial when the story changes so many times?
Well, so you've listened to the first 2 episodes where we cover Yolanda Chambers, but there's a lot of twists and turns. And Yolanda Chambers actually was not the ear witness that testified against Toforest Johnson. What you're asking about is her changing story, and why did that not stop this case from going forward? There was, in fact, a evidentiary hearing where the attorney for Ardragas Ford, Toforest Johnson's friend and co-defendant who was with him at T's place the night of the murder, his attorney called for a hearing to examine Yolanda Chambers' competency as a witness, because he said to the judge, look, the only evidence against any of these defendants is the word of this 15-year-old, and it keeps changing. So we really need to make sure she's competent as a witness and can carry this case forward. So they put her on the stand at this hearing, and she recants her entire testimony and says under oath she made it all up because she was scared, because police were threatening to put her in jail. And the police in this case, Detective Tony Richardson included, had this tactic where they would interview witnesses and suspects and give them a choice. They would say, you can be a witness or you can be a defendant. It's your choice. And really, they're telling them, you can give us the information that we need you to say, or we're going to arrest you and put you in jail. And they did that over and over again. They charged 2 people with hindering prosecution, in this case, including a 16-year-old girl, Yolanda Chambers' friend, a young woman named LaTanya Henderson, who was jailed for 5 months because she told the truth. So Yolanda Chambers recants her entire story, and the judge does not accept her recantation and allows the case to go forward. And it's unbelievable when you hear things like this, but we get the transcript out and we go through it. We got actors to bring this hearing alive in episode 3, and it's all true and it's all absolutely outrageous and absurd. that it went forward. But the ear witness that ended up testifying against Toforest Johnson was a different person that came forward telling police that she had information, and the state ended up moving towards her and away from Yolanda Chambers when they realized they couldn't rely on Yolanda Chambers as a witness because she kept changing her story over and over again.
That's ridiculous. It's so frustrating to hear that we haven't come much further than the early days of trials, or like you see scenes in like old Western movies where, you know, the sheriff rules the town and you know, it's, then you just hear it. This is just a modern take on all that. It's just, we keep doing the same thing over and over again. And it feels like if they just did their job, and we've said this numerous times before, but it feels like it would be less work if you just did a proper investigation as opposed to trying to make something like fit and then having to hear about it for years later and then having to lie about it or cover it up, or having that reciprocal answer that is always there and everyone's always asking you about it. Like, just do the job in the first place.
I know the cognitive dissonance that was involved on the part of law enforcement in the state and continues to this day. The issue that's being litigated in Toforest's post-conviction efforts is the issue of this reward payment that happened after he was convicted. The ear witness that testified against Toforest and ended up being the case against him is a woman named Violet Ellison.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
Ear witness that testified against Toforest and ended up being the case against him is a woman named Violet Ellison. And her claim was that she eavesdropped on a 3-way phone call that her daughter had made for some people that were in the Jefferson County jail. Her daughter was 16. She had a friend that was in jail. And back then, the jail had an actual payphone that inmates had to use and had to feed quarters into the payphone. So this guy called his friend and she would make 3-way phone calls for him so he wouldn't have to keep putting quarters in the payphone. Well, some other folks in the jail got wind of this. And so Violet Ellison's daughter, Katrina Ellison, was essentially working as a switchboard operator for the guys in the Jefferson County jail when Toforest was there. So Violet Ellison didn't like that her daughter was doing this, and she started picking up the phone and eavesdropping. But it just so happens the first call that she picked up, she claims was Toforest Johnson, and she hears him talking about the crime, and she's Johnny on the spot, taking these allegedly contemporaneous notes, and then calls detectives and says, I have this information about the crime, the murder of Deputy Bill Hardy, who was a family friend. It was someone that she knew, and she had been monitoring the news coverage of the murder. It was dominating headlines because it was a very high profile murder. So she testifies against Toforest Johnson. Provides the only evidence that connects him to the crime. He is convicted. And after he's convicted, she's paid $5,000 for her testimony in what's called an ex parte motion. It was off the record, so it did not go into the court file. Toforest Johnson did not know about it. His attorneys did not know about it. And most importantly, the jury didn't know about it. So the issue of this secret reward payment to the key witness has been litigated for almost 2 decades. And for 18 years, the state of Alabama said it didn't happen. And the attorneys representing Toforest Johnson met with the witness, Violet Ellison, who admitted to them that she had been paid. And the state still denied it. Finally, they produced the evidence of the reward payment, including the cleared check, the court order authorizing the payment, and emails back and forth between the district attorney's office and state lawyers that said in writing, Violet Ellison came forward and provided the information in pursuit of the reward money. And because they didn't turn this over to Toforest Johnson and his attorneys, that is considered a Brady violation, prosecutorial misconduct. That's mitigating information that should have made its way to Toforest's side, and it didn't. But so far, all the courts in Alabama have said, nope, it's not prosecutorial misconduct. Nothing to see here. The case can move forward and he can stay on death row.
I'm on mute, so you can't hear me with my disgusted harumphs and sighs. My God.
I know.
I just what more does it have to take?
That's what I'm talking about with the cognitive dissonance. It's like I've gone to 2 of these court hearings that have dealt with this reward issue, one of them in a Jefferson County court here locally. And then that judge affirmed his conviction and said this reward payment that was done off the record and not disclosed for 18 years does not amount to prosecutorial misconduct. They appealed that, and it went to Alabama's Court of Criminal Appeals, and I covered that hearing as well. And it's same thing. You go into these courtrooms, and it's this very clinical environment where they're talking about these things almost like an abstract, and you just want to stand up and scream, because it's like, how can everybody be okay with this? This is not okay. So, again, this is another reason why I felt like this would make a great podcast, because the work that happens post-conviction in cases sometimes is so outrageous, but can be really hard to unpack for journalists, for storytellers, because it can be so technical. But I think it's so important for people to understand the limitations of our system and how these things happen, in our name. This is all being done in our name.
On your website, you have a great picture right at the first page of your website of you with Toforest's family and the microphones around the table, and it's a really great picture, and you've obviously worked very closely with them. But I'm really wondering, what's the relationship like with Hardy's family, Deputy Sheriff Hardy's family, the victim of this? Essentially, you're working to send the person home who is, by law, I guess, responsible for his murder. Are they supportive, or where do they stand on this?
Unfortunately, we reached out to Deputy Hardy's family and they did not respond. And I totally understand that. I mean, I can only imagine that this murder is one of the worst things they've ever been through. I do know that the current district attorney here in Birmingham, a man named Danny Carr, he is the first Black man to be the top prosecutor in Jefferson County, which is Alabama's largest judicial district. It's where Birmingham is. And he's the first DA to start a conviction integrity unit, where he's actually willing to look at past convictions and make sure that everybody did the right thing. So he accepted Toforest Johnson's case to review. He took 9 months going over everything. He was actually in attendance at the first hearing that I covered in 2019. So that's when he started looking at it. I think he interviewed all the people that were involved, including the original prosecutor, and concluded that there were numerous problems with the process and with the way that the state went about this, and filed a motion in court asking that Toforest's conviction be vacated and that the court grant him a new trial. Before he filed that, DA Danny Carr told me that he sat down with Deputy Hardy's family and talked to them about it, and that they were supportive of him. They want the right person in custody, and they trust him to do the right thing. And so they gave him their blessing. And that really meant a lot to him. So we have not been able to talk to them, but, I know just through my conversations with DA Danny Carr that they support this. And I think that really speaks volumes. At the time that these trials were going on, and there was 4 trials in this case, by the way, Toforest and his co-defendant were each tried twice. The first 2 trials both ended in a mistrial. The jury couldn't reach a unanimous verdict. Then Toforest was convicted and sentenced to death. And then after the state had convicted Toforest and gotten a death sentence, they tried to convict his co-defendant, arguing a completely different theory that conflicted with the theory that they presented against Toforest Johnson. And by the way, that's legal. Prosecutors can do that. They can present mutually exclusive theories that cancel out the other theory against multiple defendants for the same crime. And we go into that, and it blows people's minds. But I've just completely forgotten the question because I'm still so pissed off about that part of the story, because it makes me so angry that taxpayer dollars were spent in trying to prosecute somebody using a different theory after they already sent a guy to death row. But that's the world that we live in. That's what we've got with our system.
That is crazy and really shocking. And was that all in the same like jurisdiction, like the same judge was aware of all that and everything?
Absolutely. Same prosecutor, same judge, different jury.
How the hell is that possible?
I mean, like they're essentially like, oh, that didn't work? Okay, let me just come up with something else over here. Just give me a couple minutes.
The thing that's so crazy is it did work. They used Violet Ellison's testimony to convict Toforest Johnson and send him to death row. And it was like, oh, that's not enough. Let's try again to get the other guy using a different theory. You know what they used? Yolanda Chambers. And they put her back on the stand after calling her a liar. And she was just shredded by the attorneys that were representing Ardregas Ford. And there was a not guilty verdict in less than an hour in that case. I think one of the things that is a big takeaway after people listen to all 8 episodes is that the huge disadvantage poor people face when they're charged with a crime, because Ardregas Ford was by no means rich, but his family had some resources and they were able to hire one of the best criminal defense attorneys in the United States, a man named Richard Jaffe, who's based here in Birmingham and has been involved in, he's never had a client end up on death row. So, he's got an incredible record and is a very well-regarded attorney. So they hired him and he had, lots of time and all the resources to work with. Toforest Johnson's family did not have a nest egg. They couldn't get together the $10,000 needed to pay outside counsel. So the judge appointed 2 attorneys. And in 1995, appointed attorneys in capital murder cases in Alabama were paid $20 an hour for work outside the courtroom with a $1,000 cap. And so you can imagine what kind of results you're going to get when your attorneys are being paid so little. I think that his attorneys, neither one of them are considered bad attorneys, but this was an appointment case. And, there's only so much work you can do for free as an attorney.
And when the DAC is stacked against you.
Oh, totally. But you really see that you get what you pay for, and that, justice sometimes means that it's the person that has the most amount of capital, and those without the capital get the punishment. So it's a pretty sad commentary on the way that money is a factor in our criminal justice system, and it should not be.
Yeah, great points. Wow, congrats on the podcast. I can't wait to hear all 8 episodes of Earwitness. Thank you so much for spending some time with us here today, Beth.
Thank you, Tim and Lance, and thanks to your listeners. I hope that they'll tune into Earwitness, and I am so grateful to be able to share this work with all of you.
Well, we are grateful to have you on, and keep up the fight, because it sounds like you got a lot of. I like the passion there. I like that you're not afraid to cuss on this episode because it just does make you so upset. So
yeah,
that's great. And we'll direct the listeners to the show. But where is Toforest now? Like how is he doing now? Before we wrap up.
He is an incredible person. He has an amazing amount of fortitude. and is really a source of strength, not just for his family, but for his legal team. And I think that I have really grown to admire him so much in this project. I think that he's hopeful. He's always been hopeful. His cousin, who you hear a lot from throughout the series, his name's Antonio Green, and he was sort of the closest we could get to a contemporary of Toforest. He's a little bit older than him, but they grew up together and have been a part of each other's lives ever since they were babies. You know, he told me that he thinks part of the reason Toforest is able to embody this kind of calm strength is because he internally is good. He knows that he didn't do this. He says he's good with God. He has a clear conscience. So he, of course, wants the truth to come out, wants to rejoin his family. But he says, you know, cousin, I'm good. I'm good with God, and I know what the truth is. So that's a pretty incredible thing to carry with you for 25 years while you're on death row. The fact that he's been able to maintain his sanity and these incredibly intimate relationships with his family. They're all so close, and there's such a tenderness between him and particularly his children, who he's basically parented from death row. It's really remarkable. That's part of the story that I hope won't be lost, is this kind of love story in this family that has really endured what I think has got to be one of the worst things that could ever happen to a human being, is getting convicted of a murder you didn't commit and sent to death row. But the way they've been able to handle it with such grace and maintain these beautiful relationships with each other, it's really something else.